exposed image. In other words, not black without detail, but light with details. By putting some distance between the background subject and not using any lighting from the front, the resulting image renders the proper exposure for the white background, but the subject is substantially underexposed, since there's no light coming from the front. Now that she's taken her reading, Anne places Natalie at least 10 feet from the background to avoid reflective light spilling onto her. Then she takes her shots, confident that the result will give her a silhouette. She's using black and white film, so she can't review the results. So to make sure that her exposures are right on the money, she'll set a DSLR to the same settings and review the results. That way, if there needs to be any tweaking of exposure, she can make the adjustments on her film camera. As we watch Natalie take over as photographer, note that the background lights are evenly spaced on either side of the seamless paper, and that they are the same height. It's also a good idea to experiment with poses while shooting silhouettes, and to remember that your model's facial expression isn't important, but body contours are. You want to focus on the outline of your model and how the shapes look overall in the composition. And speaking of focus, you'll probably discover that your camera's autofocus function won't work while shooting silhouettes, since your subject is so dark. Therefore, you'll have to focus manually in order to get a crisp image. Another thing to keep in mind if you're using a DSLR is to make sure you're not on auto ISO in order to avoid excessive noise. Instead, set your ISO to around 400. Probably all of you have shot silhouettes by accident, as seen in this old shot of Liberty I took about 30 years ago. This sort of thing happens quite naturally when your subject is backlit by the sun while it's low on the horizon, and the subject is far enough away that your subject becomes silhouetted. This happens because the camera's meter reads the background light instead of any light that may be falling on the subject from the front. The result is essentially an underexposed shot that makes the background look wonderfully exposed and the subject in the foreground to go black. Here's another example of an accidental silhouette. I was using black and white film when I took the shot of some ducks on the river while they were backlit by a low sun that produced bright shimmering highlights on the water. My camera's meter averaged the light in this super bright scene and gave me an exposure reading that was way too low to render the details in the birds. This resulted in them becoming silhouetted, which was fine with me when I discovered this fortunate error after developing the film. I was happy because in essence, what would have been at best an average shot became this dramatic scene of ducks that almost looked like they're paper cutouts on the rippling water. So how do you purposely shoot a silhouette outdoors? Well, there are a number of ways to go about doing this, depending on your subject and the lighting conditions. The first thing you want to do, if possible, is to shoot your subject while the sun is low in the sky. This makes it easier to compose the subject in such a way that there's a bright background to contrast against the subject. If you're not lucky enough to have the sun low in the sky when shooting your silhouette, the next best thing is to change your perspective so that the sun will be behind the subject. In other words, position yourself below the subject until the subject is located in front of the sun, no matter where the sun might be in the sky. The potential problem of doing this is the resulting gap of exposure between the background and the foreground, since the sky will no doubt be intense. But it's easily doable with experimentation and bracketing exposures. To demonstrate this technique, I placed this garden gnome on top of a fence post in my backyard. This not only enabled me to get a decent perspective of the gnome, I was able to compose my shot so I could have the sun shining directly behind it. I then took a shot at the readings my meter gave me, which resulted in a properly exposed subject. Next, I pointed my camera directly at the sun and noted that reading, which was around 3 to 4 stops higher than my first exposure. I kept my camera at this setting and shot the gnome again, resulting in a shot that was almost silhouetted, but not quite. Finally, I simply closed down my aperture another stop, and this gave me a decent silhouette. The beauty of digital photography is that you can review your shots immediately after shooting them. This allows you to make any necessary exposure adjustments. You can also go into Photoshop and tweak the brightness and contrast to achieve the desired effect. In the old days of film, you didn't have this luxury, which made it necessary to bracket exposures liberally, hoping that one of your exposures gave you what you wanted. Theoretically, you could even shoot a silhouette on a cloudy day if you work at it. The secret would be to locate the sun behind the clouds and use that as your background in order to achieve the brightest background possible. Then go from there. No matter what your shooting scenario may be, the secret to shooting outdoor silhouettes is basically the same as it is indoors. You must purposely expose for the bright background and underexpose your subject by enough that it will result in a silhouetted effect. Well, that's about it for this lesson. I'd like to thank Ann and Natalie for their contribution to making this video. I'll see you again next year. Until then, goodbye.